It's always the right time to build a Bandai TIE Fighter. And this time, I'm going to build the Bandai TIE Interceptor. Now I've already gone ahead and snapped the model up. I painted and decaled the interior and got everything ready to go. I have left the solar panels on either side so that I can pop them right off to make it easier to paint. If you're wanting some more information on building the TIE Fighter and painting the interior, check out this link up here that should be popping up about now. I did a fairly comprehensive build of a TIE Fighter and talked about all the different versions. So that should help you if you have questions about construction. Now the reason I want to build this TIE Fighter in this video is I did a Google search for something a little different. I remembered that there was a character in Star Wars Rebels called Vult Skerris, and he was a pilot for the Empire and was a hotshot fighter pilot, and he flew a TIE Interceptor that had a really different look to it than any of the other TIE Interceptors or the TIE Fighters that I've seen. It was a lighter gray with a dark gray stripe on it and some red trim around it, so I thought it looked pretty cool, and I thought that would be a great way to build this TIE Fighter. Now, step one is going to be to pop these off and get it ready to be primed. All right, I've primed everything in Mr. Surfacer 1000, and then I gave it a coat of Tamiya XF80, and both of those were thinned with Mr. Color Leveling Thinner. Now, I went ahead and overpainted the XF80 over the Mr. Surfacer, even though they were very similar colors, so that if I have to go back later and do some touch-ups, I can use the paint rather than trying to thin the primer down and make that work as paint. The next step will be masking off for all of the stripes. I printed out a picture of the TIE Fighter so that I could see all of the areas that needed to be masked. It's quite extensive in terms of all the little details and bits. What I do is I look for places on the model, like these panel lines, that I can use to align tape, and my first piece is kind of a guide point. I always detack the tape, sticking it against my hand like that, just to make sure it's not going to pull up any paint. But then I start off with my reference line and then just line the tape up using other points on the model as points of reference to help guide me and try and keep it as parallel as possible. And then once I have those main pieces of tape in, I go in and tape off the terminating points of that stripe on the top. The process on the wings is a little more complicated, but again, I find a reference point to use as the basis for where I'm going to start the masking, and then everything else works from there so that I can think in terms of relative distance from that. And quite often I'll even use small pieces of tape to measure how far things need to be apart, making little marks on them as necessary, and just getting everything as close to even as possible. Once I have the basic masking completed, then I start using larger pieces of tape to mask off the rest of it, especially on these wings, because red will cover up a lot of stuff. You'll get it misted onto a lot of things, and you can see it took quite a bit of tape to cover it up, but hopefully that will help reduce the overspray. And then here you can see that I've got the red sprayed on, and I just confined it to those areas. I didn't spray it all over the place, just right there on those areas. Now when it comes to removing the tape, I'm always very careful to pull it back against itself. Doing this will help ensure that it's not going to stick to the paint, or pull the paint up rather, and give you any problems. Slowly pulling it back against itself is the best way to go. Keeping a pair of tweezers nearby is a handy way to pick up edges of the tape that might be a little more difficult to get to. But I just slowly keep pulling that off until I get the stripe revealed on the top of the model there. And it looks okay. There's a little bit of wobbliness to it, but later weathering should take care of that. Now to get all of the tape off of the wings, and that's going to take a while, so I won't bore you with that. And here they are. And here's the pile of tape. It's quite a lot of tape, but it was necessary. So it ended up looking pretty good. Most of the areas are pretty sharp. There are a few places that I forgot to mask, and I'll need to correct those, and some areas of overspray. I'll correct those with brush painting. I used a fine point brush to go in with the paint and just cover up some of those areas of overspray. Because the paint matched the previous paint that I put on, it was real easy to do this. And it's just a process of carefully painting up to the edge and making sure that you don't add additional problems onto it. There were also some dark gray details that I needed to paint in, so I used my brush to paint those in along the back of the model, just a few areas there. And there were also some red areas that needed painting, and I did those again with the same brush, just being very careful to stay within the lines on those. And then there were a couple of areas that I created a small mask, and I used this more for a straight edge to paint along rather than painting over the edge of the mask, and it just kept that fairly nice and neat when I did that. And you can see that it gave all the little details that are featured on this TIE Interceptor. Now for the solar panels, I used some contrast paint, and I started off with a very small brush just to get up into the corners, because those can be a little more difficult to do with a larger brush. And once I had the corners knocked out, I went to a larger brush and just began painting carefully up along those lines, and then over the rest of it, just spreading it around fairly liberally. I put it on in fairly good quantities so that it would get good coverage. The good thing about the contrast paint is it will pull away from the raised areas and leave a little bit of highlight there, so I don't have to go back and do dry brushing, and it gives a pretty good look. Now I just got to do the other 21 panels on the rest of the model. Well, that sounds real good in theory, John, but after it was all said and done, I had to give everything 2 coats of contrast paint to get full coverage, and that ended up taking away most of the highlights that I'd hoped using the contrast paint would leave. So in the end, I did have to go back and do some dry brushing to correct this. It wasn't too bad of a problem, though. It only took a few minutes to correct. I used this large, soft, angled shader brush. That allowed me to get up into the corners and around the red areas very precisely without getting any of the gray paint on those others, and allowed just those highlights to pop back out. Once I had that done, I wanted to add some chipping to the model. I didn't want this to look too worn because it is the fighter, TIE Fighter of an ace pilot, so I didn't want it to be too beat up. But this will just bring out some of the shapes, help define a few of the angles, and also just give it a little bit of a combat worn look that it's been used and is in active service. I also had to make sure to get on the fuselage on that gray stripe. I thought some chips would look really good here, and so again I just used a 3-0 brush and the Vallejo Sky Gray, thinned it down about 50-50 with water, and just touched on those chips along all of the colored areas. I didn't bother chipping the light gray areas. I decided just to leave them as they are so that it would not look overly chipped, but just simply focused on the colored areas and developed those places to just kind of give it a enhanced look, hopefully. Off camera, I gave the model a very heavy gloss coat. I wanted the wash to flow very easily and clean up very easily. I wasn't going to add any additional weathering to the model, so what was added here would be pretty much it. But I just used this enamel wash and applied it very heavily, just to make sure that it covered all the various angles and recesses and shapes and volumes around the model. There's quite a few on the model, so I wanted to make sure that everything had a coat of the wash, and I wasn't too worried about being precise when it came to the application. After giving the wash plenty of time to dry, I used a dry cotton bud to go in and just begin cleaning up the excess. I generally tried to clean it from fore to aft so that any that would be left would appear to be a little bit of streaking. Now in some areas I had to go up and down, as you can see there, and I probably could have given that a little more drying time, but I'll work with it. That's okay. But this cleanup process, when it's over a gloss surface, is fairly easy, It comes up very nicely. If you do have trouble getting anything up while you're trying to clean up like this, just damp the cotton bud in some odorless thinner and everything should come right up. But after a few minutes work and about 14 or 15 cotton buds, everything was cleaned up. I wanted to keep the base fairly simple and darker than the fighter itself. So first I primed it in black, and then I went in and I just began this stippling application of very thin neutral gray paint. Now the paint for the first layer would go on very splotchy looking. It would not look good. You wouldn't want to do this in one coat, but it does leave a lot of surface texture, which is what I was going for, kind of a dirty look. But then when I went in with a second coat, this would give it a much more opaque but still distressed look, and it gives it a much better appearance than just a single coat of the paint would. Then after that, I wanted to bring out the shadows, so I applied a heavy wash of Citadel Nuln Oil. Now I wasn't too worried about keeping it off of the flat areas. I applied it over everything, and then I would occasionally go back and just wick my brush off on the paper towel and clean up some of the excess so it didn't pool too bad. But if it pooled a little bit, I wasn't worried about it because later steps would help cover this up. But this is just really making sure that those shadows really pop out so that you have some contrast in the way that the surface looks. Once I had that on there, I started doing a traditional dry brush. This covered up a lot of the splotchiness, a lot of the weirdness from before, and just gave it a really good set of highlights. This is what's really going to make this technique work, because now you have some contrast between the shadows and the highlights, and you've got your midtones. It is a quick application, but it looks pretty good, I think. And then finally, I just picked out a few panels with some contrast paint, more as a glaze, just to give them a little different look and make a few things stand out with some tonal variety. You could certainly do a lot more than I did here, but this just, again, kept it simple, which was my main goal. Once I had all that done, that was a pretty acceptable base that wouldn't draw too much attention away from the model itself. That's what I tell myself, at least. All right, well, I think I'm going to call this done. It's a fairly quick and simple finish. I could have put a lot more time into it and added a lot more little details and depth and things like that, but I just wanted to do a quick TIE Fighter build. I really like these Bandai TIE Fighters. I don't know that I'm really a fan of TIE Fighters in general in the movies, but I'm a huge fan of these kits. They're just so fun to build and go together so well, and they have so much detail. I love the surface detail there on the wings and things like that. So it's a fun little build, and if you've never built one before, then I would highly encourage it to build at least one of them. Thank you so much for watching this video, especially if you're still hanging in here at the end. I'm always grateful for that. There's of course a subscribe link down here below somewhere, and if you'd hit that and the little bell icon, I'd be most grateful. And there's also links down below to the various social media that I'm on, my website, and there's also a link to Patreon. If you'd like to support this channel and the work that I do, I'd be grateful for that. And finally, if you're already a Patreon supporter, thank you so much. You are a blessing to my family and I. You make what I do possible. We just couldn't afford to do what it is that I do without you, so thank you very much. And with all that being said, I'll leave you with one final thought, as I always like to do. In this hobby, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.